These are my favorite books of all time. Literally want to throw myself across the room because I love them so much. I won't ever stop talking about them. Here we go. First up, we have a completely underrated gem of a book, and that is Eyes of Silver, Eyes of Gold by the lovely Ellen O'Connell. Y'all, this book is one of my all-time favorite. Like, when I think of favorite books, this one immediately comes to my mind. Not talked about enough. Historical romance is a genre in general that is underrated, not talked about enough, especially just kind of in like the book talk, booktube scene. And I am personally on a mission to change that. If you love fantasy romance, I think that historical romance would totally be right up your alley. There's a lot of kind of similar stakes, a lot of similar vibes, for lack of a better word, even though I need to find another word to use other than vibes, honestly. Similar atmospheres in a sense. Obviously, historical romances aren't gonna have the magic system, fantasy world type element, but you'd be surprised on how similar they can actually feel. So this book takes place in Colorado in 1885, and we are following Annie, who is not really liked by her family. They think she's a spinster because she's 28 and unmarried. She has a lot of unladylike tendencies. She just does not get along with her family at all. And then you have Cord, who is the son of his father's second marriage to a Native American woman who is Cheyenne. So he is half white and half Cheyenne. And his family on his father's side sees his father's marriage to his second wife and him as a complete embarrassment to the family. And they also kind of fear him. So unfortunately, he is just completely outcast and ostracized, and he just kind of does his own thing. But circumstances happen, and Cord and Annie are found alone together, but like not in that way or anything like that. But they are seen together. Mind you, this was in 1885, so the time period, a lot of things were different. So Annie's father finds them together. Like I said, I feel like saying finds them together makes it seem like it's something else. It wasn't that at all. But he goes absolutely ballistic on them. And it gets really crazy. But they end up being both outcasts together. And I'll just leave it at that because I really feel like you need to read this one and not really know too much going into it. But this story is about two people who are outcast by their family, by society in different ways, who end up coming together. And it's honestly such a beautiful, emotional love story and just story in general. Ellen O'Connell is an incredible author. Her books are very easy to read. And also, y'all, a lot of Ellen O'Connell's books right now are available on Kindle Unlimited, so you don't have an excuse. Next up, we have 1984 by George Orwell, and I don't have my physical copy anymore because I gave it to my mom, but this is one of those books that I really think that everyone should read at least once in their life. So if you don't know what the premise of 1984 is, a lot of people probably do, but if you don't, this is a dystopian novel where a totalitarian form of government, also called Big Brother, is in control of everything. There's no individuality, there's no religion, no art, really, like nothing. It's you do what the government tells you to do, and that's who you are as a person. There's nothing else. Nothing that could cause you to think for yourself is really allowed, because then it would be too hard to control you. So in the book, you have Winston Smith. So he just kind of goes about the motions, you know, does what he needs to do, but he starts kind of having hints of thinking for himself, like just thinking other things. And that has something called the thought police monitoring him. There's also actually a forbidden love story in 1984, which before I read this book, I would have never in a million years guessed that there would be a love story involved. And I still wouldn't call this a romance book or anything by any means, but it is kind of interesting that that's a part of it. The characters themselves are not all that interesting, but in my opinion, the story is very interesting because you're kind of following them along and seeing what's happening in this crazy totalitarian world. Next up, we have A Court of Mist and Fury, and honestly, the entire ACOTAR series is what I would consider a 5-star series. Even though not every single book in the series for me was a 5-star read, I still look at the series personally with such fondness, and to me, it is definitely a 5-star series as a whole. But two books in particular really stood out for me from this series, and that is A Court of Mist and Fury, like I said, and A Court of Silver Flames. I'll get to this one in a minute, but A Court of Mist and Fury. So often, I find myself comparing so many other fantasy books I read, especially like romantasy type fantasy books, to ACOTAR. It lives rent-free in my head and I can't get it out of my mind. I think one of the things that makes this series just so incredibly popular is that Sarah J. Maas's writing style is extremely accessible, very easy to read, especially like if you're somebody who's never read fantasy before or you're nervous to start fantasy. Her writing style just flows so easily, and she weaves her world building in a way that it's not so like dense and like a slog to read through. It just kind of like naturally flows within the story. So this book in particular, it's the second book in the series after A Court of Thorns and Roses. This book is where the true story starts. And I'm not gonna say anything else than that, but if you find yourself not fully there yet with this one, trust me, get to this one and then see how you feel. Like, there's no way to describe it without spoiling it, so I'm just not even gonna say anything, but the true story starts in the second book, and once you read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. I feel like there's excellent world building, excellent character development, very profound moments, the way relationships are formed, the way you can learn and grow from your experiences. Don't just discount this as a girly little romantic-y little book or whatever. I mean, yeah, sure, maybe it is that, but I think it's also so much more. I think that anybody who is a fantasy lover or just a lover of a great story should just give it a try. See what you think. So that brings me to A Court of Silver Flames. So this book focuses on my favorite character in the series. I'm not gonna say who because I don't want to spoil. The funny thing is, if you start reading the series, like if I said who and you start reading the series, you'd be like, what are you talking about? That's your favorite character? What the heck? But this book really shone this person in a new light. I loved the character development. So incredible to see somebody who struggles with like anger issues, lashing out, to just like holding things in, not being able to process their emotions properly. And it just like comes out to other people to the point where they don't know why they do that. Like, why do they lash out like that? And it's kind of about this person trying to like deal with their emotions and how they get past it, and also just kind of like finding their inner strength throughout. I personally feel like, though, the overwhelming amount of smut, of spicy scenes in this book, which were very graphic, by the way. This was a very spicy book. I think it detracted a lot from this beautiful, blossoming relationship that was kind of growing from a very dark place. It got bogged down a lot by those scenes, and I think that that page time could have been used more for the actual relationship itself other than that kind of stuff. That's just my personal opinion. I just feel like it was way too much in this book. I still gave it 5 stars because the actual plot line itself was so incredible and beautiful to me, but that's just my opinion on this book. I still love it. Next up, I have Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, and this is a sci-fi. So in this book, you're following Ender, who is an incredibly intelligent kid. He's a little kid. So Ender gets recruited into the military, and he ends up going to the military academy to play simulations of military games, essentially just to prepare him for the future. The politics in this book are crazy, so fast-paced, so thought-provoking. And I think one of my favorite things about this book is that the kids are smart, but they don't act like adults necessarily, even though they're very intelligent and they're able to understand concepts and process concepts differently, but they're still kids, and you still see kind of like that kid element come out. The fact that he was able to write these kids in such an intelligent manner, but still able to retain their like kidness is really fascinating. This book also had an insane plot twist that I was not expecting, and it smacked me across the face, and I had such a visceral reaction to this book. I also did a video where I read this book and watched the movie, and if you want to see me just like completely roast the movie, check it out, because I did. Next up, we have Mistborn. I do not own a physical copy of this book, but it is a fantasy book by good old Brandon Sanderson, who is a very popular fantasy author. Maybe contrary to popular opinion, I don't really know. The first book in the series is my personal favorite. The other two, in my opinion, just weren't as good, but that's just me. A lot of other people have different opinions. A lot of people think that the third book is their favorite, but this world has a really unique magic system, which is called allomancy, and it's where people can like push and pull metal and like consume metal, and it gives them different powers. Very interesting, very unique. I've never read anything like it before. But this is set in a world led by a tyrannical government, and the leader of that is the Lord Ruler. And this book is kind of like almost like a heist meets like a rebellion. I will say though, this book started a little bit slow, but it just ramped up, and the ending was so freaking crazy and intense. And this book was one of those that played out in my mind like a movie. I feel like it would make an incredible movie, honestly, and I hope that it gets adapted one day and done justice, because like the end scene, would be so good on the big screen. But this book has political intrigue, found family, and there's actually a surprising small little romance subplot in Mistborn, which I totally was not expecting. Then we have If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nowlin. This was an unexpected 5-star for me. So contemporary romance in general is honestly not really one of my favorite genres, but young adult contemporary romance is especially not really one of my favorite genres. I just have a hard time finding a lot of books in those genres that I like, I guess, that are more than just like kind of a 3-star that I mildly enjoyed. But this book is emotional, it's angsty, it's so teenager, but like in a good way, not in a bad way. And it's about a girl and her childhood friend who end up drifting apart for whatever reason, and they kind of slowly come back together, like reconnect as friends in high school. And it takes place over the course of the entire high school. So you kind of see these characters growing up, and sometimes it is very immature, but it's immature for a purpose. And for me, it just kind of reminded myself of like my high school self, or just like, you know, giving those feelings of high school again. There's definitely some immature moments, but this book also at the same time is very mature, just in the way that it tackles different subject matters, things like family issues, mental health issues, just kind of growing up. And it also was so freaking sad, but I still loved it. It like ripped my heart out in a good way. Next up we have The Wrath and the Dawn by Renée Ahdieh, and this is a young adult fantasy. So in this book, the Caliph, or the King of Khorasan, takes a new bride every single night, and then by morning, the bride is dead. I don't know why I laughed, but nobody knows why this is happening. They assume he's just like a crazy, murderous king. So one of Shahrazad's best friends was one of these wives who ended up dying at the hands of the king, and she is just so torn up about it. She wants to seek vengeance for her friend, so she agrees to be one of these brides, and her whole goal is to kill the king and avenge her best friend. So this is a retelling of 1001 Nights, which is a Middle Eastern folklore, folk tale, and it is so beautifully written. I really love Renée Ahdieh's writing style, and this is a fantasy romance book. It's fantasy, but honestly it feels more magical realism, like folklore type fantasy, than just like what you would normally think of fantasy. But it's such a great story. The characters are great. The main character, Shahrazad, is incredible. She's sassy and I love her. And there's a sequel to this book that I still haven't read yet, and I don't know why, and I need to. Next up we have The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and this is another 5-star series. So Jude in this book is one of my all-time favorite book characters. If you are looking for a fae story, like fae, fairy tale type story, this is the one for you. I was watching a Haley fan video and she referred to this as like Tinkerbell type world, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is so true. I've never really thought about that before, but that makes total sense. It's kind of like Tinkerbell, but give it political intrigue and like really high stakes. And the romance element in this book is really great, but it's also not the main focus. This is kind of more of like a romance subplot, but really more so like a fantasy political intrigue story, but not like boring political intrigue. I know a lot of people hear that and think like, oh, that's boring, whatever, but it's not. It's so engaging, so exciting. You're seeing like leaders and rulers. You're seeing like the power balance and how little things can influence it, and like behind the scenes, little treachery. It's so much fun. I think if you really like fantasy, but you kind of want to try out some romance, but like you don't really want to fully go all in on the romance, I think that this would be a great one, because the romance is done very well, but it's still not not the main focus of the story. Next up we have Waking Olivia by Elizabeth O'Rourke, and this is a sports romance, and I think it's the only sports romance I've actually ever read. In hindsight, I probably should read more because I really love this book. So the main character in this book is Olivia, and she is a track star. She's rough around the edges. She has a really bad attitude problem. She doesn't really do too well with authority. She's got a lot going on. She also has another problem that I'm not gonna say, but once you know that, the title will make a lot more sense, and like it'll be like, oh, like light bulb moment. And this is actually a forbidden romance book, which I know sounds like, ooh, forbidden romance, that sounds crazy. But it's really just because the romance is about Olivia and her coach, her track coach. But it's nothing really that weird because she's an adult, she's in college, and the coach is really not that much older, but they're not really allowed to date or anything because obviously he's her coach. Heads up though, this one does have a lot of spice in it, a lot of spicy scenes. I know a lot of people like to know that going into it because different people have different preferences on that kind of stuff, but it is still a wonderful story, wonderful love story with a ton of emotional depth, a ton of story development. It's definitely not like a all spice, no plot type book at all. Moving on to The Bridge Kingdom, and y'all, this book, this one, and The Traitor Queen, these have my whole heart. My entire heart belongs to these books. So The Bridge Kingdom is the first book in the series. Then you have The Traitor Queen. There is also two, they're part of the same series, but I think they're also a little bit more like spin-offs because they're about another character in the series, not the main two in these ones. And those are also part of the Bridge Kingdom series as well. But I have only read these two books of the series. I do need to read those other ones as well. But these books are set in a fantasy world that actually has no magic system. So it's pretty grounded in reality for the most part. You know, it's still a fantasy book, but there's no magical powers or anything like that. So if you're not really a fan of like magic or like magical powers in books, but you still want to read fantasy, this would be a great one for you. And the world this takes place in is basically a bunch of kingdoms that are connected by these massive bridges. And there's one kingdom in particular that is in control of the bridges called Ithacana. And then you have Lara, who is a trained warrior princess who basically is on a mission to infiltrate Ithacana, who controls the bridges, to help better her kingdom, because in this world, whoever controls the bridges basically is in control. And Lara, in my opinion, is one of the best examples of a strong female character in the best way. No Mary Sue's here. She is not a Mary Sue at all by any stretch of the imagination. If you are a fan of enemies to lovers, this is peak enemies to lovers. One of the best enemies to lovers stories I have ever read. Like true enemies to lovers. Sometimes you read little like contemporary romance enemies to lovers and like I'm not disparaging them at all, but they're like, oh, I hate my boss. He told me to stay late at work one day. He's my mortal enemy. Like it's, and then you get to like fantasy enemies to lovers and they like actually try to kill each other and are literal enemies. And it's so different. So if you want like true enemies to lovers, this is great. And honestly, the first book was a 5-star. The second book is equally a 5-star. I can't choose between the two which one I like more. They're both so good that I just kind of see them as a continuation of each other. So good. Ugh. Then we have Goodnight Beautiful by Aimee Molloy, and this is a domestic thriller with literally the best, craziest, unexpected, unreal, insane plot twist I've ever read in a book before. It shocked me to my core, honestly. And like me saying that, you might go into it being like, oh, like now I know there's a twist. Even though thrillers, there's always a twist, so it's fine. But like you won't see it coming. I'm just telling you right now. Go read it. If you prove me wrong, comment down below that you like saw it coming. But I can almost guarantee, that you probably will not see it coming at all. It's emotional, psychological, and since it's a domestic thriller, it's not really that scary. Like, you know, some thrillers can get really scary, but like in general, thrillers are not horror, so it's not like super frightening or anything like that. But this is just like, it's so suspenseful in such a subtle way. And in my opinion, a very underrated thriller, an underrated thriller author. She has another book that I need to read because I want to read more of her thrillers and I hope she writes more and more and more. But it is about a woman and her husband who move into this house. Her husband is a therapist, but he works from home. So he has like a home office down in like the basement or the bottom level of the house. And she discovers a little vent in the floor upstairs. So she's able to listen in on her husband's therapy therapy sessions, which I mean, like that already sounds like a great setup for a thriller. I'm not gonna say anything else other than that because you just need to read it. But what does she hear? What does she discover? I don't know. You'll find out. Next we have Gleam by Raven Kennedy. So I don't own the physical copy of this book. I do own the first book in the series, which is Guild, and this is the plated prisoner set. It used to look like this, which I actually also really like these covers as well, but I thought that this one was really cool and it's one of my favorite series of all time, so I just got the special edition anyway. Neither here nor there. So I'm a big fan of this entire series in general. I'd probably consider this a 5-star series as well for me, even though the 4th book wasn't really my favorite, honestly, but even then, the whole series is great. I highly recommend it. So this is a dark fantasy romance, and the character growth and character development is one of the best I've ever read in a book, especially in Gleam. So the series starts off, like I said, with the first book, Guild, and this is such a tough one to talk about. Okay, so you know how in A Court of Thorns and Roses I said the second book is when the story really starts? This is like that. If you've read ACOTAR, you probably know what I'm alluding to. I don't want to really give it away though, or anything like that, but just the first book is not what the story is truly about. It's definitely like a setup. It's to get you to know the characters, to understand where Aaron is coming from, and kind of I just like get so excited when I talk about it because like to know where she starts and where her character goes is just insane and I love it. So I'm gonna give a very mild spoiler. I don't really think it's that big of a deal because like I said, the first book definitely is like a setup for the rest of the story, but if you like to go in blind to things, I would just like skip ahead a little bit. I feel like it'll explain some things if you start reading it and you're like, well, what am I even reading? Here we go. So this story is about somebody who deals with Stockholm Syndrome, pretty severe Stockholm Syndrome, and like you're seeing her in the first book still in the midst of that, and she thinks she knows what love is, and it's really not the case. And like us as the reader, we see that and we know it and we're like, what is going on here? And I think a lot of people probably go into this book not knowing that, so that's why I think it's kind of a little bit important to say it. But you go into the source book and you're like, I was promised like a fantasy romance. That's not romance, that's awful. What a horrible person. Just know that that's what it is. It's Stockholm Syndrome. It's not meant to be a romance. Like the first scene in particular is like, woo, like it's crazy. Raven Kennedy chose to do it to kind of tell a story and kind of put you in the perspective of somebody who is really dealing with this. It's also just kind of a darker toned, more mature book in general. So just be aware of that. There's a lot of mature elements, mature themes in these books. Like I said, the 4th book wasn't necessarily my favorite. I still rated it like over a 3-star, I think, or like 3.5, maybe 3. But there's a new book out that I need to read. I'm gonna reread the whole series again before I read the newest book because I want to re-immerse myself in the world and just like refresh myself on the story before I get to it. And a really cool thing about the story is it kind of touches on the story of King Midas. You know, like anything he touches turns to gold. That's a big part of the story. Next up, I have a manga. I know the rest of the books I talked about were not manga, they were just normal books, but I wanted to include this because I really loved it, and it is Goodbye Eri by Tatsuki Fujimoto. He was also the mangaka of Chainsaw Man, which is a very popular anime if you're familiar with it. And this is a one-shot manga, and that means it is pretty much a standalone. So you don't need to commit to an entire series of anything. The entire story is in this one volume right here, and this was so great. I read it in one sitting because I couldn't put it down. It was super quick and easy to read, and it was also super thought-provoking. Made me think about a lot of things. I'm still honestly kind of confused about it, but like also in awe of the story. Just the way it was presented was just so unreal. Like, how can somebody think of that, honestly? But this story is about Yuta, whose mom is sick. She's terminally ill, and she asks him to document the final days of her life, which, you know, is already like kind of crazy in and of itself. But that is kind of how the story is set up. And after she passes, Yuta meets Eri, who sees this movie, this video he's created about his mom, and really likes it and sees like potential in him as a filmmaker. So she shows him a ton of movies, and they like watch movies all the time together, and that's just kind of what they do when they like watch movies. They analyze movies, they think about things, and the way the story explores the topic of grief is done in such an interesting and unique way. And it's honestly, it's hard to explain. Like, it's tough to explain what this manga is about. I feel like it's one that you should read, especially if you're a movie lover. I think that it would be great, but just in general, if you like kind of like stuff with emotional depth, the story is not what you think it will be. Like, you're gonna go in thinking it's one thing and it's just not at all. It's even better. Honestly, I would call this a masterpiece. And even if you've never read manga before or anything like that, I think that it's worth the read. Also, manga is pretty easy to read because it's like majority pictures and short little phrases and words, so don't be afraid to try it out. It's pretty easy to get used to, honestly. All right, y'all, well, those were my 5-star reads currently. Of course, that will probably change in the future. I hope it changes in the future because I want to discover more 5-star reads, but those were some of my all-time favorite books. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your 5-star reads or like some of your favorite books of all time down in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.